Japan is one of the world's most important, influential, and powerful nations, home to nearly 126 million people. The Japanese economy is the third largest in the world, after just behind China and the United States. And correspondingly, Japan owns the third of all the world's countries in total number of assets and total amount of wealth. Japan has its own army, which is one of the best military in the world. It is the foremost leader in the robotics, automotive, and electronics industry. While the culture is widely known as regarded across the world by all accounts, Japan is one of the 21st century's great power. But Japan also has a massive problem that is making the country weaker and weaker now for decades. And that problem is simple. Japan is shrinking, not in terms of land or territory, but in terms of people, which at first seems a little strange. Japan is, after all, one of the most densely populated and urbanized countries in the world. More than 90% of the population live in cities, and with the population of more than 38 million people, the Tokyo metropolitan city is the largest city in the world in terms of population. But Japan today is experiencing what's called a super aging society across the entire country. Today, more than 1 out of 4 Japanese people are above the age of 65, which is approximately 36 million people, and it is caused to the entire population of the world's largest city, the Tokyo metropolitan. This is the highest percentage of elderly people of any country in the world, and it's substantially higher than the most other places in the world. For context, here is the list of other countries by elderly population. And Japan is above them all, whoopee 27%. To be fair to Japan, a lot of this is simply due to the fact that the life expectancy in Japan is unmatched anywhere else in the world. As of today, the average Japanese person is expected to live to the old age of 85 years, which is also higher than any other country in the world. People in Japan simply live longer lives than any other people or nation in the world for a very long list of reasons. Decades of peace and prosperity following the Second World War, some of the most advanced medical technologies in the world, and dramatically improved nutrition are all heavily contributing factors. All of this is led to the somewhat unique situation of there being more than 2 million people in Japan who are older than the age of 90, and more than 80,000 people who are older than 100, which is rather incredible because the Japanese people themselves only constitute about 1.6% of the entire worldwide human population. But of the human alive today who are above 100, nearly 20% of them are all Japanese. In isolation, the incredibly long lives of people is not a problem, but it's a huge sign of tremendous success and shows that the country is healthy, peaceful, and prosper enough to enable so many people to live so long. And when combined with Japan's other problem, it makes the aging and shrinking problem with the countries going through even worse. And that other problem is an incredibly low birth rate. Like every other industrialized country that made transition from agrarian society, Japan's birth rate exploded throughout the process and peaked in the 1920s, when Japanese women on average were having 5 children, which has dramatically increased Japan's population. In 1945, immediately after the Second World War, Japan had finally just ended more than 8 years of continuous warfare against almost the entire rest of the world, with the deaths of more than 3 million Japanese, which is about 4% of the total pre-war population. At that point, Japanese women were still having 4 children on average, while the average life expectancy at that time was only 52 years. But after 1950, Japan's birth rate began to shrinking, and in the 1960s, the average Japanese women were only having 2 children on average. And in every single year after 1974, the average has been less than 2 children, meaning that Japan's births have been below the country's natural population replacement level. In 2005, the Japanese fertility rate is the all-time low. At that time, the Japanese women having on average just 1.26 children each, and it's barely recovered from there since today. This means that the Japanese population reached the highest that it's ever been in 2008 at about 128 million people, and it's been continuing shrinking ever since then. Now the Japan's population is 2.4 million less than it was in 2008, and it's rapidly getting worse. If the demographic trend remains the same as they are today, then Japan's population will decrease by about a third to only 87 million people by the 2060s. So the million-dollar question here is this: why Japanese people are having so few children? Well, there is a lot of factors, but the big one is that the young people in Japan are facing a lot of insecurity. Nearly 40% of the entire Japanese labor force today are irregular employees, which means that they are working part-time temporary jobs or gigs, and their earnings are 53% less than the average American doing the same job. To make matters even worse, more than 1 in 10 Japanese employees work over 60 hours a week. More than 9,000 Japanese companies have employees working more than 80 hours of overtime in a month. Most of the employees don't even take half of their allotted annual paid leave time off, while 3 out of 10 women do not take any childcare leave. Many Japanese men and women simply feel overworked to establish romantic relationship or family, which brings us to the next problem: the very unusually high rates of invertility. There's a study conducted back in 2015 that found 1 in 10 Japanese adult in 30s, men and women, both reported absolutely no had ever sexual experience of any kind. And the fact that the Japan's population is shrinking by so much has caused still a lot of unexpected and pretty interesting problems. Currently, for every 5 workers in Japan, there are 2 elderly people who are beyond retirement age. And in order to support them, Japan is expected to be spending up to 28% of their entire GDP on social welfare by the middle of this decade. And it's keep going even worse. By 2060, that number is expected to be 4 elderly people for every 5 workers, and nearly 40% of the Japanese population by that point are expected to be seniors, which means that the government is going to have to spend even more on healthcare and welfare. But this is going to be hard to sustain because as Japanese elderly population increases, the cost required to support them obviously go up as well. But as the young population of workers continues to decrease, so the Japanese government would have no other choice to apply high taxes and borrowing more and more money. And this problem has already gotten severe enough that Japan's current debt is more than 13 trillion US dollars, which is more than 266% of the entire Japanese annual GDP, meaning that Japan is already the most debt-ridden developed country in the world. It also means that the government is closing down more and more schools for kids to about 400 every year and replacing many of them instead with nursing homes for the old population. It also means that ever since 2014, there have been more adult diapers sold in Japan than baby diapers, since there are so many elderly people in the country. A modern phenomenon known as kadokoshi has been becoming more and more frequent, and every year, thousands of isolated, lonely elderly people die and go unnoticed for several days and weeks. It's a very unique kind of modern tragedy. Now the obvious answer to all of these problems that we have discussed all here, that is immigration. Western European countries along with the United States and Canada have all pretty much solved their own demographic crisis by encouraging young working age people to immigrate from elsewhere. But Japan has resisted this option since pretty much forever. Currently, only about 2.3% of the Japanese population are immigrants, which is the lowest percentage of any developed country in the world. And in 2015, less than 20,000 applications for a Japanese citizenship were even approved by the government. People just don't really move to Japan very often, and it's largely because for centuries, Japanese civilization has been pretty opposed to it. After all, Japan is a bunch of isolated islands separated across the ocean from the rest of the Asia, and across the centuries, Japanese rulers have taken advantage of that fact by completely banning all foreigners, and they did it between the 17th and 19th centuries. Unlike other developed countries, Japan is basically an ethno-state, and it simply never really had any history of immigration from abroad. And as a result, Japan is today the 6th least diverse country in the entire world, with nearly 98% of the population being ethnically Japanese. And there are fears and concerns about many that opening up the country to large-scale immigration from abroad will permanently change the Japan's unique culture and identity. But today, they may not have any other choice. A UN study conducted in 2000 found that in order for Japan to maintain its worker to retiree ratio, the country would either have to raise the retirement age of workers to 77 or allow the immigration of more than 17 million people from the abroad. Japan's primary crisis in the 21st century is what decision to make in binary choice. Either continue on with this population crisis or begin encouraging dramatically more immigration from abroad with all associated social problems that they will come with. The choice is ultimately Japan's to make.